Sleep with age, infants sleep a lot, believe it or not, although they don't always sleep on parents' timeline. That's the real problem, right? They don't want to sleep when parents need to sleep or want to sleep. But they do sleep a lot. And half the time spent asleep is in REM sleep. And if we're talking about REM being dream sleep or some sort of organizational sleep where we're forming synaptic connections, then this makes sense because they need those synaptic connections to form for those neurons in their brain to survive. Okay, and then as we age, sleep becomes less prevalent. But once we hit our 30s, it starts to stay somewhat stable at that point on. All right, duration and quality of sleep. Usually infants sleeping around 18 hours, ranges anywhere from 10 to 21 hours. By the age of 2, this is reduced. The quality of sleep is one of the best predictors of executive function in early childhood. So if this infant's sleeping very well, that means by the time they get to early childhood, they may, relative to their peers, be planning and making decisions at a slightly higher level. Potential relationships with theory of mind, with self-control, may be related to sleep as well. Okay, if there's some struggle with that, there tends to be some tends to be a predictor of inefficient sleep later on in life. Okay, and parental responsiveness and the culture can kind of have an impact on when the infant can sleep. So in some cultures, mom is working, and mom is working out in a field, and mom needs infant with her all the time while she works. And so infant may be carried around in some way on mom's chest or back, and infant's got to deal with it while mom works. And so infant sleeps maybe there if they can fall asleep, but a lot of the times it's really dependent upon the culture. For us, it's when we get into childhood, we'll see that it really depends on when school start times occur. You've got to remember, it's a legal imperative for kids to go to school. They have to go to school. Parents have to send them to school, and they have to do so at certain times a day. And that doesn't really matter if it corresponds to the psychological needs, physiological needs of the kid. Although these things are getting better and school start times are starting to change as our information about sleep progresses. All right, so let's say we have mom that had some trouble, had some postpartum depression. And we now want to know, does this relate to infant stress profile? And we're going to look at cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that's released by the adrenal glands when that fight or flight response is activated, fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, so when that HPA system becomes activated. Now, infants' salivary cortisol, they're just going to swab gather the saliva, and they're going to measure the cortisol in it. Okay, how much of that hormone is there? Now, what they noticed is that if mom was depressed and unresponsive to the needs of the infant, then the infant had a very weak stress profile, in that there were very high levels of salivary cortisol. Now, if the mom was responsive, and it didn't matter if she was depressed or not depressed, if mom was responsive to the infant, then the infant had a healthy stress profile. In other words, salivary cortisol levels were relatively normal. There was not really any concern that this infant was stressed out. All right, so mom's responsiveness, even in her period of struggle, okay, to overcome depression and anxiety, is very important for the future life of this infant. So that's one of the things, and that's very difficult sometimes, and it's very difficult to want to take care of yourself or anybody else when you're depressed. But it has a very real influence on the future life of someone if a depressed mother can find a way to be responsive and remain responsive to her infant. All right, sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. I'll let you read through this slide a little bit. It'll give you a little bit more information about SIDS. And please also watch the video. It's a very good video about SIDS and what we know about it. Certain sleep settings are better for infant. Sleeping in the prone position versus sleeping supine is very important. We want the infant on its back. We want on a firm surface. We want good airflow in the room, so sometimes a fan is warranted to help circulate the air. Okay, all these things are very good things. Remember, SIDS is something that they think may go on with the respiratory system, or failure to get that appropriate levels of oxygen. Nutrition during infancy is very important. Fruits and vegetables, high antioxidants, proper fats. Okay, all of these are very good for the infant. Go ahead and watch the video. It'll give you a little bit more information about breastfeeding versus formula feeding. Formula feeding can be adequate, and it can be just fine as long as all the proper nutrients are there. Now, there are some benefits to breastfeeding that we're going to talk about in just a second. And there are some benefits to mom if she chooses to breastfeed, in that the risk of ovarian cancers tends to decrease when moms breastfeed. Now, of course, which came first, chicken or the egg, you know? Okay, these are always questions with correlational data. All right, this is a study that was also done by Alyssa Epple, one of the researchers that originally found a relationship between telomere length and psychological stress. So telomere length are the ends of the chromosomes that keep the chromosomes structured. And as you age and as you're stressed, these telomeres decrease in length, thus making the structure of the DNA a little loose and unraveled to some degree. And then enzymes can go in there and make more mistakes in the form of mutations. Okay? And most mutations are not good mutations. They're not adaptive mutations. They're mistakes. Okay? And so we want to keep those telomeres healthy. And one of the ways to do that is by being breastfed. They found a relationship between infants that were breastfed and future telomere length at the ages of 4 to 5 in the preschool years. Okay, so that was kind of interesting. Another thing that was interesting is obesity related to shorter telomeres, and that older fathers tend to have offspring with longer telomeres. So what does that mean? That may mean that if dad is able to produce viable gametes that can successfully impregnate or fertilize an egg, then it may be that dad has relatively high quality gametes. Okay, and those high quality gametes are and DNA very beneficial to the offspring. All right, so that's a possibility. But there are a lot of other interesting things in here, like drinking soda and shorter telomeres. Okay, I certainly have drank soda, so I wonder what my telomeres are like. I feel okay, but I don't know. Infant reflexes. So these are some infant reflexes. Take a look at these slides, review them. They're covered pretty well in your textbook. So take a look. They're also covered pretty well in the article about the NNNS that we read previously. And same here. These are more infant reflexes. So I'll let you watch these on your own time. Then gross motor skills. This is a progression of motoric behavior through to walking. All right. It's even not uncommon for an infant to not walk until like 15 months. So don't want to be too overly concerned about these stages or this progression. Be sure to always talk with your medical providers if you have any questions about your infant's development through these stages. Okay, sensory development. Sight is relatively poor when the infant's born. It doesn't see all that well, and it has to develop. Infants need a lot of visual stimulation to help these visual systems develop. So be sure they're provided with those opportunities. By the age of 6 months, their vision's relatively normal. Remember the perceptual changes, though. Infant needs to see safe objects rolled to and away from it. Infant needs to have opportunities to navigate through a 3D environment. All of these things are important for the visual system and other systems to come online and start to wire themselves. Hearing is usually pretty good at birth. Infants, newborns tend to understand loudness, pitch, and localization, even though they're a little less sensitive to it, and there is some learning that must take place. Pitch is something people really try to work to learn, and musicians will spend their whole lives trying to master it. All right, and localization of the sound is important. Where's mom? She just called me. Where is she? I need to know. Okay, and that's a very important feature of that system. Okay, touch and pain. Infants do feel pain, and this was heavily debated and contested, and in some ways it still is today. But infants feel pain. Okay, they feel touch and they feel pain, and the question really is are they remembering it, and what types of psychological changes might occur if they're presented with and feel pain. Okay, taste discrimination can usually happen pretty early, and there are changes in preferences and taste across the lifespan, and same in infancy and as a neonate. Smell smell is very important for infants. They need to be able to locate desirable food, and they do grow and start showing a preference for mother's breast pads by the smell of the breast pad, and thus indicating a preference for mom's milk at around 6 days of age. So it happens pretty quickly. And then these intermodal and systems, these intermodal perceptions coming from multiple sense modalities, can be tricked to some degree. And I'll let you watch that video about visual illusions that occur during infancy. Okay, so Piaget's sensory motor substages. So now we're focused on the sensory motor stage of cognitive development, where everything is learned through the senses. And for Piaget, this is kind of an outline of how the infant progresses through the sensory motor substages. So we've got the infant that's born. The first substage is first habits and primary circular reactions, where the infant's forming habits, and it's not really there are some attempts to reproduce chance events, but it's not really purposeful, and there really certainly aren't any true mental operations taking place yet, according to Piaget. Secondary circular reactions are a little bit different. Behaviors are going to occur based on their consequences. So you'll see them avoid displeasant consequences and work to obtain pleasant consequences like food and warmth. Coordination of secondary circular reactions. This is from 8 to 12 months. This is where sense modalities start to become coordinated and behaviors become intentionally driven, and they start to use tools to acquire some of those resources that they want. Okay, tertiary circular reactions and novelty. This is where they start entering those terrible twos, where they get really interested in exploration and seeking out novel stimuli. They also start showing some signs of creativity. Parents may end up going, whoa, I have no idea where they came up with that. All right, that's a new one. Okay, and with that said, it's very important that we make sure we appropriately child-proof the house during this period, because infants going to get creative in their search for novelty. Novelty is what's rewarding. If they can find a novel space, they're going to explore it, and sometimes those novel spaces house things that they don't need access to. Okay, internalization of schemes. This occurs from 18 to 24 months. These are where symbolic representations start to be formed and where there's object permanence. So in other words, in order for there to be object permanence, there needs to be some sort of internalization that the object is there. Okay? And if that internalization is not there, and that symbol isn't in their brain, then there's no way that they can possibly find it. It's gone, disappeared. If it's occluded, it's gone. Okay. Now, some have contested Piaget's pure interpretation of the progression through the substages, in that we know object permanence can occur a little bit earlier than what it did. Also, deferred imitation can occur much earlier than it was proposed to occur by Piaget. And Dr. Andrew Meltzoff shows that here. Be sure to watch the video and see what you think about deferred imitation. Okay, so we get into evaluating Piaget's theory, and the A naught B error is kind of interesting with object permanence. So watch the video, learn a little bit about the A naught B error. It's where the infant will select the location where they previously found a toy or something that was occluded, rather than searching the place where they saw someone place it. Okay, intermodal perception is also occurring much earlier than Piaget expected. And so what we now kind of know is this core knowledge approach, that infants tend to have a basic understanding of space, a basic understanding of number sense and quantities as being more or less, not number sense in advanced calculus or arithmetic, but number sense in the sense that they understand what appears to be more or appears to be less. And a lot of this is done with like eye gaze research. Object permanence, when something is still there versus isn't, is earlier than expected. And language development can occur earlier than expected by Piaget. Excuse me. Attention. Different forms of attention that I want you to know for the exam. Sustained attention. This is prolonged attention, allows you to work with the stimuli for longer periods of time. Habituated responses, or where there's decreased response rates to an unchanging stimulus. This is important for psychological functioning. We need to be able to tune out stimuli that are unchanging. Dishabituation is where there's a sudden increase in responding to a stimulus that it may slightly change, but it was a previously habituated there were previously habituated responses to those stimuli. And then joint attention is where the infants will engage and follow the attention of someone else. So somebody else may be looking a certain way, and those infants look that way too. If you ever have gone on a walk and you see somebody looking up at the sky, you may find yourself looking up at the sky too to see what's up there. Let's join attention, even though maybe the person's looking at nothing. And maybe you try that at some point. Maybe you go stand and you're going on a walk and you want to see if somebody will engage and join attention with you. So you just kind of look up and see what goes on, and then you're going to know if they're engaged in that joint attention with you because you look and they're looking up too. And they're probably wondering what the hell you were looking at because you were looking at absolutely nothing. So anyway, moving on. Visual preference, they have these at early age. They tend to gaze longer at novelty, and so if you're showing them two different images and which one looks new and which one looks normal, which one you've already seen, they'll look longer at the novel image. Visual recognition of memories, once again from eye gazing, we can do that. And then cross-modal transfer, where acquired information from one sense guides another modality. Okay, so we're getting information and we want a more holistic perspective of what's going on around us. And so we not only attune our eyes to what's going on, but maybe we might listen and smell and maybe feel or whatever else we need to do to make sense of our surroundings. Okay. Fair at all? Oh, and let me go back to that for just 1 second. You see this a lot in our understanding of language. We not only listen to language, but we're also going to look at the person's face. And we're going to feel out the surroundings to fully understand the meaning of the word or what was even said. And without that context, you can lose a lot of the meaning. Okay, perceptual learning and discrimination of monkey faces. This is kind of an interesting study, and to me, it gives a very hopeful message. Excuse me. Okay, well, there are some interesting things that occur with our interpretations of our surroundings. So, and specifically with perceptual narrowing. So there's this common phenomenon called the other race effect. Okay, and the other race effect means that individuals are more likely to identify specific people within their own race, okay? Within their own race, within their own group. They're more likely to individualize those individuals, recognize their names, recognize their individual features, all right? When presented with an other race, okay, someone that's not of the same race as you, and this doesn't matter the starting race, that doesn't matter. What matters is that the individuals are of an other race, okay? Then it becomes more difficult to differentiate individual features. However, and this is the same is true, or the same is true for looking at animals. When you look at a bird, you don't see individual birds, do you, flying in the air? I mean, you may recognize them as individual birds to some degree, but you don't call them that. You call them by their bird, or you call them, if you're really good at it, you call them by their species name. Okay, now, what happens though if you spend more time with those birds or with individuals from other races? Well, then you start to pick up on those individual features. Then you start to pick up on names and individual identities. Okay, and the same is true with birds. And I've had particular experience with this working with bush babies. You go work in a bush baby lab and in a non-human primate lab. When you walk in there, all the animals look the same to you. Over time, with working with them and being around them, you start to recognize the individuals, and you start to remember them, and you start to see their unique features and their unique personalities and temperaments and the way that they interact. All right, and so they did this with infants. Okay, they did this with infants that couldn't tell you, other than through eye gazing, that they recognized the difference. Okay, and so what they found was that there was increased exposure, or familiarization led to the infants being able to recognize individual difference in macaques, in an entirely different species. And that's what we know occurs in animal labs. That's what we know occurs in multicultural settings where individuals from different groups of peoples are interacting with one another. They get much better at recognizing individual features. And I find that very hopeful. Memory. Implicit versus explicit. We talked about implicit memory as walking. These are processes where consciousness is not necessarily required. You just do these automatically. Explicit memories, consciousness is necessary. And for detailed facts. So in infancy, there's this kind of infantile amnesia that occurs where you don't really remember anything during infancy. You certainly don't have any explicit memories, but you do have some implicit memories. I mean, during infancy, you learned how to walk, and guess what? Many of us are still walking, and it comes automatic. If not that, then there are other processes that are automatic that we learned during infancy, but we don't have explicit recollection of them. Okay, so some measures of infant development. Arnold Gessel developed the developmental quotient, where they looked at motor skills, language development, adaptability, personal social skills, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to create like an intelligence quotient, but for infant development, to see where they are in relationship to their peers. Nancy Bailey's scale was very similar, except they're going to bring in the socio-emotional component to it, as well as the cognitive components. Fagan test of infant intelligence is going to take into consideration this information processing model. So what are the features of this objects? How are they different? Can you categorize them? Can we look at the infant's eye gaze to know how they categorize them? And then go ahead and watch that video about the 3-year-old member of Mensa. I find it kind of interesting. Of course, you could have a 3-year-old member of Mensa if you're just looking at the extremes of the distribution of IQ or whatever we're assessing. Mensa is for highly intelligent, genius level individuals as they fall along the IQ distribution. Some of you may be members of Mensa. I'm not. Okay. So with that said, congratulations to those of you that are members of Mensa. And for those of you that aren't, be sure that you are very hardworking. If you are a member of Mensa, I encourage you to also use your skills, work with those abilities. Okay, don't fall back on them because somebody said that you were very smart. Okay? In fact, that's kind of one of the things that I know I'm going off on a tangent, but it's an important tangent. Dr. Catherine Sanderson talks about this a little bit, and she says, you know, it really is about finding enjoyment in the work that you do. Okay, and Carol Dweck goes into, and this is another tangent, where if you're rewarding someone for the hard work that they've done and the persistence that they've shown, they're more likely to produce more than if you reward them for their intelligence. So be careful with intelligence. Feeling intelligent can be a debilitating thing at times. We want to make sure that we continue to work and strive. Predictive value. Gessel's, what's the predictive value of these assessments? Sometimes not very good. There are oftentimes other measures that are more predictive. For example, Walter Mischel's done a lot of work with self-control in infants or self-control in children, and it seems that children that have the ability to um, control their impulses are more likely to have better outcomes in academia and in their vocations. So maybe that there are other factors that are more predictive. Language development, and Jeannie, I'm going to let you watch that on your own. They're looking for they're looking to determine if language development falls along a critical period or a sensitive period of development. And it's a very sad documentary, so I kind of warn you from watching it. You need to watch it, but it's sad. And there are unfortunately modern examples of it too. Recognizing sound and meaning, we got phonemes. These are basic units of sound. You can watch that video of the McGurk effect and get a basic idea of how intermodal perception relates to our understandings of sound. Morphemes are the smallest units that contain meaning. So prefixes, suffixes, syntax. We're looking at how words are put together to produce meaningful sentences, and there can be many cultural differences in the way that words are structured together to produce sentences. And then some semantic features. What are the meanings of the word? What's the connotation of the word versus the denotation of the word? So if I were to say girl versus woman, well, girl, you're thinking someone that's younger, maybe has similar features as a woman, but still very qualitatively different. A woman is someone that's mature, is grown, is maybe has reproduced or is very capable of reproduction, and you don't really get those same connotations with girl. Same thing with boy and man. Boy is an immature version of man and is qualitatively different. Okay, language vocalizations in infancy. They may cry, they may coo, they may babble. Babbling should be encouraged to some degree, even though it doesn't really make much sense. And our language to the infants is typically different. We have this infantile speech where we come in and it's called motherese, where we'll come in and we'll just talk in very gentle, soft, very basic language, so that the infant can start working with these symbols, because that's all that words really are, is they're just symbols, and when placed in an appropriate context, they have meaning. Okay, gestures, pointing, symbolic gestures. Infants start to recognize this. Their receptive vocabulary develops first before their spoken or productive vocabulary. And then they'll start producing these two-word utterances that have some meaning, and you can somewhat make sense of them, but they're grammatically incorrect. Okay, Broca's area is primarily for language production. Wernicke's area is primarily for language comprehension. And if one of these areas is damaged, you may have trouble with one of those things. So somebody with Broca's aphasia may perfectly understand what another individual is saying and directing them to do. However, they may not be able to produce language well enough to state that they comprehend a certain process or the directive. Noam Chomsky talks about this language acquisition device. He says that it's innate, it's built into us, and we have a basic understanding of the rules of language. You leave infants together, they start forming their own language. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be learned. Now, with principles of learning, vocabulary does seem to develop with learning mechanisms and psychological mechanisms that aren't necessarily innate. B.F. Skinner showed this with operant conditioning, and hopefully you watch those birds learn to read. And here you're going to see some criticisms of true behavioristic principles, in that there are probably, and there are in many species, cognitive mechanisms at work where the individual is internally playing and manipulating these verbal symbols. Okay, and you can see that with Alex the African Grey and Irene Pepperberg's work. Andrew Meltzoff is also going to talk about child-directed speech and learning during infancy. Okay, child-directed speech, or this motherese, is where we're going to recast or rephrase the child's words to form a better understanding. By rephrasing, you're also showing them that different versions of their sentence also work to convey the same message. So they may have at some point a grammatically incorrect version of a directive, and so the mom may, or dad may, or caregiver may come back and say, hey, did you mean for me to go grab your bottle? Okay, so then they're putting it in a grammatically correct structure. They may expand upon something, may elaborate upon it. So once the kid has an understanding of animals, they may expand upon the idea that, okay, animal jumped. Okay, well, that's great. The zebra jumped over what? Over the log. Okay, and so you're expanding upon it to give that kid a little bit more depth of comprehension. And then labeling. We go from very general, these are animals, to very specific. These are lions. These are tigers. These are a specific type of tiger. Okay? Basic emotions are those that this is more or less an innate way to communicate. And we saw that with Darwin's article on his infant, that basic emotions like smiling, fear, these are all readily comprehensible. And we can still recognize these quite easily. So number one, you've got a smile and happiness. Number two, you've got surprise. Number three, you've got an individual that's kind of looking at you as though what you did was beneath that person, and that's contempt. Here in number four, you've got sadness. And number five, you've got those big wide eyes. It's maybe that guy just saw a grizzly bear or something. There's fear. For me, that's what happens if I accidentally drive through or ride through walk through a spider web. There it is, fear. Below, maybe this person just smelt something not so good. That's disgust. And then 7, something just upset this person. You can see the way the eyes and the grimace on the face, the snarling in the face, that's anger. Okay, FBI says that there are 7 of these. Okay, basic emotions. Some others have placed it at, I've seen lower numbers, I've seen higher numbers, but these are the basic emotions. Okay, so primary emotions: pride, joy, anger, sadness, fear, disgust. Okay, all those that we just saw on the last page. Contempt. Okay, and then there are these self-conscious emotions. So as the individual's theory of mind starts to develop, we start seeing jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, guilt. Well, what are all of these emotions? These are emotions that are related to your position within the social group. So jealousy, well, I don't have that, that red fire truck. I want that red fire truck, and that kid over there has it. Well, that sucks. Okay, jealousy. Empathy. Oh man, that kid just, nailed its foot on that stair and fell on its elbow, and that it's holding it now. Let me go run to the teacher or to parent and point and show what just happened. Okay, why is that? Because the infant knows that if I were in that same situation, that would suck. That wouldn't be very good. Okay, and then so all of these more self-conscious emotions are about you and your position within the social group. Okay, Dr. Campos does a study here on the visual cliff. It's a very classic experiment. And a visual cliff is a plexiglass cliff that kind of extends out. And then there's this, so you're on a table, there's plexiglass on it, you can see that the table's right there, and then it extends out and there's this cliff. It falls, there's a big drop. But there's still plexiglass, so the infant will be safe if they walk out there, but the infant sees this big old cliff. And what Campos wanted to know here is, does locomotion and motoric development facilitate emotional development? Okay, does being able to move around, right, yield some emotional development? And what they found was, yes, it does. Okay, as the infant starts becoming more active and moving around and crawling and doing these things, they start to realize that there are other dangers in the world. They've bumped into stuff. They may have fallen a little bit. And they understand that things that are way down there and going off of this cliff could be a very dangerous thing. So when these researchers tried to set these infants down that were already moving around, they tried to set them down on this visual cliff. They'd reach out their hands, they'd show like fear and have increased heart rate. Before that locomotor ability, they didn't have that increased heart rate. They didn't know what it meant. They didn't need to know what it meant because they weren't there yet in their ability. Caregivers needed to know what it meant. Caregivers were to take on that fear and that responsibility. Okay, here are some visual examples of Campos's work, and many other researchers have done a lot of work into the visual cliff. I had a good student a few years back that really dug deep into visual cliff experiments, and I'm not going to go into all of that here. I'm just going to discuss the classical work by Campos, but those articles are out there if you want to dig very deeply into our understandings of the visual cliff. Okay, mother's attachment and infant fear. So we know that this is something that can happen. They've shown this with visual cliff studies as well. But here what they're looking at is, what's the toddler's ability to self-regulate their own fear response? In other words, we want healthy fear. We don't want the absence of fear. We don't want an overabundance of fear. We want healthy fear. And so what we're going to do, we're going to bring moms in, interview them, identify them as secure, dismissive mothers. Then we're going to take a look at the infants. We're going to monitor the infants with their moms during some sort of fear-inducing test where we give them these very scary stimuli. And we're going to see how moms interact with the infants and how infants interact with their environment and what emotions they're going to express. Well, here are the findings. Secure mothers tended to have children that showed interest in novelty and new things, okay, with less fear. They were they were more exploratory with their behaviors. They investigated. And smoothly regulated children were also better self-regulators of emotion. They'd see something new that was kind of scary. They'd show a little bit of that fear, but then maybe they'd show interest in the stimulus. Okay, and you can watch the video about Dr. Vaughn talking about his research with children and his work with graduates, and I hope it kind of gets you interested a little bit in studying the lifespan of humans. Okay, emotional development and social relationships. Infants can produce everything from a basic cry to a fake cry at times. This becomes very difficult because you want to make sure that you're attending to the child. Other individuals that haven't been around the child much may not really recognize the different cries, but caregivers can typically recognize basic cries from angry and painful and fake cries. There is some stranger anxiety in infancy that's appropriate. That's very appropriate. Being afraid of or cautious of new things is a good thing. But as we saw, you know, infants cueing in on what mom's doing, and so if mom or caregivers are showing that they're comfortable in a setting, then it's more likely that the infant will warm up. There can be separation protests where when the infant's left, there's crying and some frustration there produced by the infant. Smiling, there are reflexive smiles where the infant will smile to when there's no real stimulus that's required, no social stimulus that's really required. And then there are the social smiles where mom will smile and infant will smile back. Okay, so getting into this, there's a lot of questions about autism and what's going on. Well, if we take a look at infants and young children and we start recognizing early, very early, the signs and symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, we can then get a better idea of what we can do to help the individual overcome their struggle with autism. Some of the social impairments are like struggles with joint attention, they don't make eye contact, they don't share emotional reciprocity, so if there's a smile, they're not smiling back, okay? And there are some nonverbal and verbal deficits, so you see maybe some odd behaviors that aren't consistent, some nonverbal expressions that aren't consistent with the context. Okay, these at-risk children, they're less likely to make eye contact. Their eye gaze will shift frequently. They have some poor facial recognition abilities. They tend to fixate on objects, and they're sometimes occasionally fussy. And so what Dr. Tarbox is going to say is that with certain techniques and operant conditioning, at an early age, these individuals can, in his words, recover from autism. Now, there's still a lot of work being done on this, and as you can see, this is relatively new work. So I don't want to produce any false hope, but there is hope. I just don't want any false hope. Because recovery from mental illness is still something that we're, as a culture, we kind of struggle with. I think it's possible. Certainly there are researchers out there that think it's possible, clinicians that think it's possible, but there's still many skeptics. And that's a good thing. We need that skepticism because we want to make sure that we're not going to deliver false hope. And I don't think this is false hope, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to refine the techniques and make sure that it's working for everyone on the spectrum. And here are some references for this lecture. There are several slides trying to be consistent with the historical prevalence of work done on infancy. So I hope you all enjoyed it. That concludes this unit and this lecture, and so please email me if you have any questions.